Thank you very much, folks, for joining us. Great to have you with us again. Our topic today is managing freight costs. And if you've been on our recent coaching sessions, you'll know these are very quick. It's going to take 20 minutes, including questions. The whole purpose here is to give you some great tips, no fluff, no mucking around, and then you can get back to work. So I have, I think, 7 tips to talk about today. So just before we do start, let me just mention that if you have any questions, do tap them into the question box as we're going. And I may answer some questions as we're going through, but I'll certainly answer all of them at the end. And if you scan that QR code, you can connect with me on LinkedIn if we're not already connected. I think most of the people on the call I recognize as being connected with already. Okay, so we're going to look at 7 points of review and improvement on freight, and we're talking road freight. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly, but I'm going to spend a little bit more time on number 6. So we're going to have a look at capacity utilization, matching tasks and resources, volume leveraging, task integration, whether you should have dedicated transport resources or not, and contract terms finally. But I'm going to spend a fair bit on this rate competitive one because there's something there I want to share with you that I think a lot of people get wrong. And it is not about the specific rate that you pay for a unit. Okay, it's really understanding how rates are put together and how you can get the most benefit from that. Now, if you have your workbook to hand, those of you who joined in the last, well, prior to yesterday, you would have received via email your workbook. There's a page on there where you can jot down each of these opportunity areas of the 7. And so, for example, it might be rates, and then you can make a note about whether it's an issue or not for you, whether it's an opportunity that you're going to chase or not, and the potential impact on it, so that by the end of the 20-minute session, you'll have an idea of maybe 2 or 3 areas that you can focus on for improvement. Okay, and that's what it's going to look like by the time you're finished, and we'll come back to that. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is capacity utilization. And this may seem very simplistic, but a lot of people make some very fundamental errors here. So if we're looking at this photograph, for example, of this truck being loaded, what do you immediately notice? We've got on the right-hand side here a very tall pallet. We've got some quite small ones over on the left-hand side. We've got some sort of medium ones in the middle. If we're not able to stack freight on top of those pallets, we're not utilizing that space effectively. What that means, and most of you would be using third-party carriers rather than your own trucks. Most people do these days, but even if you're using your own trucks, what that means is you're paying to transport fresh air at the top here. And so it's very important that you understand not only the capacity of the vehicles that you're utilizing and how your freight's going to fit into it, but the impact of that on your rate structures. So if you're paying for a pallet, for example, you're going to be paying 2 pallet worth for this one on the right because you're occupying 2 pallet spaces. They can't be double stacked. This one on the left can be double stacked, so you'd be paying a pallet rate. So it's really important that you understand how best to utilize the capacity. Of course, on a lot of transport, you would be utilizing that top space for smaller pallets, for fragile freight, and so on. Part of this is also making sure that you have the right size vehicles for the task, and we'll talk about that for a moment. So we're starting off with a pretty obvious one there. Make sure you're utilizing the capacity well. And if your freight is a strange dimension, don't think that you're not going to pay for it with your carrier. You will. If, for example, this pallet on the right, it's basically occupying the space of 2 pallets, you're going to end up paying for 2 pallets, simple as that. So you need to understand the impact of all of that on your freight. And in terms of capacity utilization, I reckon there's probably 3 areas to focus on. There's the space itself. So we've talked about, how those pallets fit in. Look for things like pallets out of gauge. So, excuse my rough drawing here of the pallet. But if you've got a product sitting on the pallet and it overhangs the pallet, it's out of gauge, you're going to be paying for the additional space that the carrier can't be using. So think about space utilization, overhangs, height, pallets that are not square. Think about handling. Does your freight need any specific handling? Is it fragile? Do you need tail lifts? Is it going to go through sorters, that type of thing? And the other thing that we should be looking at in terms of utilization is time. So think about, the shift patterns that you're using for that freight, either your own transport or carriers. Think about time windows for delivery. Think about whether you can do off-peak pickups and deliveries. So, all of that really comes into the utilization. And one of the things I would really stress on all of this is communication. Communications with your own teams. So make sure that people loading the vehicles, the warehouse managers and so on, are well aware of what impacts your freight spend, what your freight rate structures are like, and how the freight should be presented to make sure that you're not going to incur additional charges. So that's very much about utilization. What about task and resource matching? Number 2. I still see a lot of companies getting this quite wrong. And it's a question of not only the vehicle itself, but going to the right freight companies for the task that you have. And if I can share this maybe in terms of a very simple diagram, you should be looking for freight companies that are basically looking after the right geography for you. So, I'm based here in Australia. I know a lot of the people on the call are in Australia. If you're doing predominantly metro deliveries, that's fine. If you're doing country deliveries, are your carriers used to doing country deliveries? Do they have the expertise? If they don't, they're only going to be subcontracting. Do you have the right carriers in terms of the right industry expertise? That can be really important. So, some of the sort of left field ones that I've done over the years were ugly freight like steel. You can't have general carriers necessarily doing that. You want people who understand the product, the challenges of hauling that product and so on. You want to think about the transport modes. Are they particularly strong in the modes that you're dealing with? And lastly, have they got the right sorts of equipment? So there it might be cranes for unloading, it might be tail lifts, it could be the specific size of the vehicles. Okay, rattling on through. Number 3, volume leveraging. Is anyone brave enough to type into the question box how many different carriers, how many different transport carriers you utilize? Do have a go, and I'll tell you what the record is. Just type in how many carriers you think you might be using. 3. That's pretty good, Colin. That's pretty good. Yep, 3, 6. Yeah. Anybody above 10? The most I have seen is 230. So why do people use that many carriers? They tend to be companies that are very large, very diverse, multi-divisional facilities and branches all over the country, and they have generally grown through acquisition. And what tends to happen is that everybody has their own favorite carriers. They've been around for years, and you end up with this huge range of carriers. Very often, different branches using the same carrier with different rate structures. And so it can be a little bit of a mess to manage. So, what's the right number of carriers? I mean, if we're looking at, say from 200 down to 1, in a country like Australia, I'd say you're doing pretty well if you have less than 10. It's very hard to have 1, and I think people have this idea that, let's have 1 carrier to do everything. In a country like Australia particularly, that's a real challenge because different assets, different skills, different experience are required for metro country deliveries, and a lot of it tends to get subcontracted. So you're going to be using probably more than 1, but 200 plus, nah, maybe not. One of the other reasons for using more than 1, other than capability, of course, is spreading the risk. And I think that's a pretty good reason to, we've had a couple of really big carriers here go out of business recently. So spreading the risk is not a bad idea. Having maybe different regions with different carriers. So, you know, don't feel sort of too bad if you have 10 or so. There can be very good reasons for it. Let's look at number, what's this, number 4? I've got something in the way of the number here. Number 4, task integration. This is pretty simple, but sometimes gets overlooked. So this basically means that we want to try and utilize the freight in 2 directions in its simplistic form. So if we've got, let's say, line haul deliveries going out across the country, try not to think of them necessarily as one-way trips. Do you have transfers coming back? Hopefully not. That's another issue in terms of network management. But if you have product that needs to go in the opposite direction, try to utilize the same vehicles, you're going to get much better utilization out of those. So in its simplest form, you could be doing that. You could be dealing with transfers as well. So try to utilize the vehicles in both directions. Why am I not clicking forward? Let's go, come on, Rob. Number 5, dedicated resources. This is an interesting one. There can be a lot of benefit in actually running your own transport operations, but I would give a word of caution. So where I've seen it work really well is, for example, where there are specialized vehicles that are very highly utilized. You know, they're sort of going from A to B and back again. It's almost this sort of milk run backwards and forwards. And I've seen that work really well with bulk tankers, where they're just going round and round in a loop almost 24/7. So you'd say to yourself, why wouldn't we run those ourselves, or why wouldn't we have dedicated resources from a carrier? So that can work pretty well. Really ask yourself the question though, do you need dedicated resources? Is there a reason for that? Are they specialized in some way, like those tankers? Are they for carrying fragile freight? Do they have special equipment for offloading the product? You know, that's fine, and it can be a really good way to lock in capacity, if you like, by having that dedicated fleet. And I've seen that work really well with industrial products, steel products, and that type of thing, where it's very hard to just call in extra vehicles at short-term notice. So you want to lock in that base fleet. I think where people tend to go a little bit over the top, though, is they lock in a fleet that's too big. So really have a look at the task and say, if we're going to have this dedicated fleet, what's our base fleet that's going to be really well utilized? And then what could we actually buy in ad hoc to top it up and try and get that much more effective? And then, of course, do look at the rate structures. There's going to be generally a fixed rate structure for having the fleet on call. There's going to be a variable cost based maybe on tons or pallets or kilometers. Just make sure that that rate structure is working for you and that you're not really sort of paying over the odds. Now we're going to come to the one that I want to spend a little bit of time on, and it's rate competitiveness. And this is not about, you know, we're paying $25 a pallet and aren't we doing well? So is this working well? Yeah. It's not about the rate per se. It's a little bit deeper than that. So let me walk you through an example here. The first thing you really need to understand is your freight profile. And by that, I mean, how much are you shifting on an annual basis? And typically, what are the consignment sizes? So on this example here, I've just got a sort of very simple example where we're shifting all kinds of consignments from about half a ton up to a B double. And those overseas, you don't have B doubles, that's a double trailer truck. So you've got your semi-trailers and then you've got B doubles. And if we look at the frequency distribution, if you like, of the consignment sizes, what we find in this example is that around the 10-ton consignment is our most common consignment size. Now, this is where people sort of fall into a little bit of a trap, because they may get rate structures, rate cards from a carrier, and they'll look at the rate card and they'll say, wow, you know, haven't we got a great rate for a 3-ton consignment? Yeah, but that's not your most common weight break. You want to be making sure that the 10-ton rate is a good one, and over here that the full semi-trailer is a good one. You can bet that your transport companies will be looking at your freight profile very carefully, and they will definitely understand this, and they'll know where they can sort of adjust rates to be competitive and to be attractive. I'm not casting dispersion on freight carriers here, but I have seen it where a company has got a fantastic weight breakdown here, and a rate rather for that weight break. That's not the one they want. They want this one. So how do we use that in practice? Well, we actually obviously need to understand what the weight breaks are and the rates that are applying to them, but also the profile of our freight and what are the most common weight breaks. And why is that important? So let me just draw back in what our freight profile is. And then we'll have a look at the sort of logical discounts. So the way it works, and if we're working on a kilo rate, the bigger the consignment, generally, the bigger discount you get off that basic kilo charge. So I'm going to make this very simplistic, but logical would look something like this. So as your consignments get bigger and bigger and bigger, you get a bigger discount off that kilo charge. Okay, so as we're getting into 3 ton, 5 ton, 10 ton, and so on. That's what logical would look like. And obviously, as you're getting into the semi-trailers and the big doubles, you should be getting really good rates there. What can happen is this, the bottom line, where you get this sort of thing. And what are we looking for here? Our most common consignment size is here. We probably ought to be getting a rate of, what's it, about 25% discount off the kilo rate, but we're not. We're down at about 12%. So it's very important that you actually understand your freight profile and how that applies to the rates that you're being offered. That is an absolutely key tip and the key one that I want you to get out of this session today. The last one that we're going to mention is terms and conditions. And there's a couple of elements to terms and conditions. One is the straight sort of legal stuff, compliance, insurance, how damages are going to be treated. I'd say that the bigger the contract you have, the more influence you have in challenging some of those terms and conditions if you're not happy with them. Most are generally okay. So that's the legal side, and then on the other side, it's more related to the task itself. And some of the things that you're looking for in there, this really sets you up for success, but you're looking at how do we undertake rate reviews, what triggers rate reviews, what triggers rate increases, how do we treat fuel surcharges, how is reporting going to be conducted, how are we going to encourage innovation. You do need to put some effort into that to come up with some carrots for the transport companies, where some incentives, where you can encourage them to innovate, to try and improve their operations, to try and reduce cost. It's kind of a two-edged sword, of course, because if you're encouraging them to reduce the cost, they're reducing their revenues. So generally what you're doing is you're playing around with margins so that they can actually get more on the bottom line by helping you reduce costs. So there we go, a quick gallop through the 7. And if you've got your workbook in front of you, have a look then at these 7 and consider, are you actually using capacity correctly? Are you actually paying for space that you're not using? Have you got the right resources, the right equipment? Are you leveraging that volume? Have you got 230 carriers, or are you down below 10? Or like a lot of people on the call, you're down to 3, 4, 5, 6. That's really good. That's a good number. Are you integrating tasks so that you can utilize the fleet as best you can? If you've got dedicated resources, have you got the right level of base resource, and are you topping up then as required? The rate competitiveness, the big one is understanding your freight profile and where you need the good rates and where it's not so important. And then in terms of the contract, just making sure that on the legal side it's good, but also around the sort of task itself. So there we go, a quick gallop through in 20 minutes. Hopefully you've got a couple of things on your to-do list. We'll come to questions in a second. Just before I do that, if you've been on these chats before, you'll know that we like to reward you for joining us. And as a thank you today, what we've done on behalf of everybody on the call today is donated 50 days of access to life-saving clean water in Cambodia, one of our favourite charities that we give to. So everything that we do at Logistics Bureau, we try to link in some sort of charity element to as well. Kind of makes it a bit more worthwhile doing what we do.